All right, we're back for another album episode, a WP in 30, a WP in 3D. Dave and Alex here to talk about the Grateful Dead's second studio album, Anthem of the Sun. Holding it in my hand right here. It's a really good album, and their second offering from a studio standpoint. Back in January, we talked about their debut album, San Francisco's Grateful Dead. We're going to try to do one of these each quarter. So if you're just joining us, this is not what we usually do on Workingman's Pod. Usually we're talking about a live show, and we're talking everything about it. We go through a background, what was going on at that time, what's going on with the songs. We do a song by song breakdown. With these album releases, we try to keep it tight, 30 minutes or less. We're talking about the background of the album and then, of course, the music. So that's what we're going to aim to do today. So, Dave, before we dive deep, what was your history with this album before this episode?
None. Not a single listen. No idea. Got to go in blind.
Okay, nice. So I had listened to it before, but it's not one of my favorite Dead studio records. And like many Deadheads, I think once you listen to those studio albums once or twice, and then you get into the live stuff, you kind of drift away from listening to the studio releases, with the exception of a couple for me. And so I also didn't have like a very long history of listening to this album. And then this was the first like focused, attentive listen that I ever did was for this episode. So it's kind of cool. We're both going into it at different levels of kind of unfamiliarity. I think that leads to some pleasant surprises, but I guess we will get there. Before we talk about the music, let's talk about the year. So 1968 in music, when reviewed from 2022, some interesting stuff was happening in 1968. Johnny Cash performed at the Folsom County Prison. I think that's a pretty legendary moment in music history. David Gilmour joined Pink Floyd.
That's big time.
Yeah, a watershed moment for that band. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about Pink Floyd later in this album, because I think that there's some connective tissue between this album and the Pink Floyd album from this year, Saucer Full of Secrets. Bill Graham opened the Fillmore East, where there were many, many legendary concerts, including some by the Grateful Dead. Another interesting one from this year is the Beatles went to India to be with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, and begin to kind of explore that side of things. It definitely clicked with George Harrison more than it did with the others. That became something that he kind of connected with for the rest of his life. But for all of them, kind of an interesting experience that definitely changed their music for the last couple of years of their performing life. Bands formed in 1968: Black Sabbath, Crosby, Stills and Nash, Deep Purple, Rush, Yes, and Led Zeppelin. Bands disbanded. What?
I said, oh man.
Yeah, some big ones. Yeah. Bands disbanded, not shockingly, based on the ones I just said were formed. Buffalo Springfield. So Stephen Stills left to become, a named player in Crosby, Stills and Nash. Cream, the Yardbirds, both at one point.
Yeah.
Eric Clapton, Johns. So they all broke up in 1968. Billboard Top Album of the Year was Hey Jude. Number 2 was Marvin Gaye's Heard It Through the Grapevine, and Hey Jude was also the top song of the year. 11 weeks at number 1 on the charts. So about a fifth of the year at the top. So pretty classic year for music. A lot of good stuff came out that year. The White Album by the Beatles is my favorite album of theirs. The Kinks, Village Green Preservation Society, is a great album. Some really good stuff in the mix. This album was I would say probably the most important point of the Dead's year in 1968. They played a lot of great shows throughout 1968 as well. They're very, very busy that year. But this release being their second label released by Warner Brothers. And when you read, and I'm going to say some of the quotes, what the band said about this record in particular, I think it was a really, really important album in their genesis, and especially in this 1960s psych rock era that they were really born in. I think that this is an especially important album. It was released July 18th of 68 by Warner Brothers Records and Joe Smith. In the inside of this vinyl is the letter that Joe Smith sent them about this album. Very infamous letter. It gets a lot of coverage in the Anthem to Beauty classic rock albums documentary, which you can watch for free on Amazon Prime, and the Long Strange Trip documentary, which is also available on Amazon Prime. There's a lot of attention on this recording and that letter, which you can find the letter and we'll post a link in the show notes. But my favorite quote in it is Joe Smith calls it the most unreasonable project with which we've ever involved ourselves. And then he wrote a pretty tough letter to Dan Healy and the band. Again, I'll put a link where he basically castigates them for being difficult to work with, but also includes some oddly low blows about their future in music and basically says, you guys aren't going anywhere if you don't learn how to control yourselves, especially Phil Lesh. They're like, you really need to control Phil. This guy's out of control. The impetus for that letter, to which Phil wrote in all caps, fuck you, and mailed back, is that David Hassinger, the producer of this album and their first album, he quit about a third of the way through the production of this. He basically threw his hands up and said, I'm done. You guys can deal with it yourselves. And then it became an in-house project that was produced by Dan Healy, and Jerry and Phil were mainly the leads on that. So in the So Many Roads book, which is a great book about the Grateful Dead, Phil says, he's quoted as saying, Hassinger literally threw his hands up and walked out mumbling. A famous anecdote about that is that Bob wanted the sound of thick air on the album, and Hassinger was like, what the fuck does that mean? And left. Bob was later quoted many, many years later in the 90s. He said, I couldn't describe it back then because I didn't know what I was talking about. I do know now. I wanted a little bit of white noise and a little bit of compression. I was thinking about something kind of like the buzzing that you hear in your ears on a hot, sticky summer day, which makes sense. But being a young fellow at that point, I think 22 years old, he didn't have the vocabulary to say that at the time. So he just said thick air. And there was some talk about we should go into the heart of LA and record the air in downtown LA, and then go out into Joshua Tree in the desert and record desert air, and then put them over each other. So there's some weird stuff going on with this one. If you want to learn more about that, again, go check out those two documentaries that I mentioned. They're both fantastic. This was recorded in studios across 3 different cities, LA, San Francisco, and New York, between November of 67 and February of 68. And then it also includes a bunch of live snippets from concerts that were also recorded by Dan Healy around the same time. So a cool pastiche of studio and live stuff, which was a bit of a sign of things to come with Live Dead just a year later, which was really a mix of live and studio stuff. So other things that are notable about this album, it's the first record cut of a Bob Hunter song, Alligator, were his lyrics. So that would obviously be, the next most important member of the Grateful Dead besides the people who are playing music. And it's cool to get his first lyrics. Side A is mostly Bob and some Jerry, and then side B is mostly Pigpen and some Jerry. So it's kind of cool that they divided it that way. I think that it leads to both sides, each side of the record feeling like of a piece together and whole, which I really liked when I was listening to it. The artwork is probably the trippiest the band ever created. I would say it's really cool looking. It's drawn by Bill Walker, and it's basically like a mandala of this like Vishnu looking creature in the center with its arms coming out, and then on each of the arms is a head of one of the members of the band. Here's what Bill Walker had to say about the art later on. Quote, the drawing unfolded intuitively and spontaneously. I didn't have to think about what I was going to draw. It literally projected itself out of my head onto the canvas. I had the sense that my eyes were merely transferring, out of a boundless and radiant space, the image onto the canvas, and all I had to do was effortlessly delineate or play the patterns I was seeing on the canvas. It took a little over a week of very intense participation. Most often, I had no awareness of day or night, and I recall eating only a few times. So a real
Whoa.
like peak psychedelic experience for Bill Walker and coming up with this, which is pretty cool. I also found another quote that Walker gave to Grateful Dead historian Blair Jackson for an issue of the Golden Road zine back in 1986, where he was talking about how he incorporated the likeness of the band into the artwork, which I think is cool. He said, I tried to perceive each person's subtle energy patterns. I didn't contrive it. I just painted what I saw. I think that's pretty cool. It's interesting when you look at the faces. It's like I can tell which one is Pigpen, I think, and I can tell which one is Jerry, I think, and Bobby, kind of. But also, they all had very similar facial hair at the time, and so that also makes it a little bit trickier. And it's interesting that it's like he was trying to convey the energy that they were putting out more so than the exact features of all their faces. Um, Much more psychedelic idea than just a perfect recreation of all their faces. Um, And then the last note is the reception of this album. I think rather than talking about the critical reception, what I was more interested in is how the band received this album, how they perceived it, what they thought about it when it was done. And it seems like they all really loved this record, especially Phil. Jerry, in the Anthem to Beauty doc that I mentioned, he compares it to a flashback to the acid tests. And he said, quote, "It was far out, even too far out. We weren't making a record in the normal sense. We were making a collage." That quote is from Grateful Dead, The Illustrated Trip. So he thought that this album was pretty wild. And I've got a quote from Phil that I'll read later on about his view of this album. Um, Anything else for you as far as background goes, Dave, before we get into the track list?
No, I just think it's important to emphasize the splicing and amalgamation of like live and studio. Because if you're not ready for that, kind of off the rip, you might think like something's going on. But when you know that, I think it actually makes listening so much better. And you can hear it meld together and know that they were playing around and doing stuff with technology that really hadn't been done at that time. And I think that that is so noteworthy and makes this album like so much more of a milestone than their debut one.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. So did you know that going in?
I did not know that going in. I only knew that through researching.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Why would you? Right? It looks like
Right.
a studio album. It seems
Right.
like a studio album, and so you listen to it. But then I think that especially in That's It for the Other One, which is the opening track, it becomes pretty clear that that's what they're doing. You can
Right.
kind of hear where it cuts from studio to record, but they do it in a really weird way. So let's get into it. The track list of this album is quite brief. It's only 5 songs. That's It for the Other One, New Potato Caboose, Born Cross-Eyed. Those are the 3 tracks on the first side of the LP. And then Alligator and Caution, Do Not Stop on Tracks on the B side or the second side. So beginning with That's It for the Other One, which later became just the other one.
Right.
But in this era, it was That's It for the Other One. That's how you see it on their live recordings. And that's because they would do cryptical envelopment, I should say, into the other one. And on this one, I think that they break it down even further. So you have one, That's It for the Other One, A, cryptical envelopment, B, quadlibet for tenderfeet, C, the faster we go, the rounder we get. Um,
And then D, we leave the castle, like that part four.
on the
Um,
on the LP that I have, it doesn't have that, but yeah, that makes sense that they would have different labeling on different sources depending on what you're looking at.
if you're
Um,
not too familiar with Primal Dead, how I would describe the like 3 or 4, depending on which version, songs in this whole suite is Cryptical Envelopment 1, the other one, Cryptical 2, like a cryptical reprise,
yeah.
and then the Tom Constantin horror picture show. Maybe more accurately, like a as much of a studio version of feedback as we're ever gonna get.
It's funny because like the couple of studio feedbacks that we did get are all on this record. There's I think arguably one on each side, but yeah, it's like I think the other thing that you'd call it is if not a Tom Constantin horror show would be like proto Phil Lesh, like just seashells or whatever he called his more exploratory spacey stuff that he would do with Ned Legan in the latter year or later on in their run. It gets so weird,
Yeah.
with some like bleeps and bloops and cymbally chimey sounds. And but before we get to the end, let's start with like the beginning of this one. So first of all, the other one was played 656 times by the Grateful Dead. Cryptical Into the Other One was only played 41 times, and all but four were between 67 and 69. Dead and Co. have played it a couple times, but not in a number of years. And Phil and Friends have always played it. They've just always gone to these songs. As long as there's been Phil and Friends, there's been Cryptical Into the Other One. But this was definitely the longest lasting track from this album. It had the most staying power within their live act, which I think is interesting. How did you? So you and I both dig Cryptical and the other one a lot, and especially
Oh
these
yeah.
early Primal Dead ones. We both really have a fondness for. What was your thought on this rendition or this, you know, recording of this track?
I think the cryptical sides are pretty elite. I think the other one is pretty good. The notable thing with the other one is that you can totally tell that they're going into live track mode with
Yeah,
their with playing around with it. The cryptical, I think, I mean, I couldn't really tell. It sounded mostly studio based, but it wouldn't surprise me if they were weaving it in there too, especially in the back half. But Jerry sounds great. The pigpen organ kind of really grounds you where you are in that time in their career, and that was pleasant to listen to. And then yeah, the other one is pretty good. It's not a rager, but I don't think it has to be, right? Like it's the studio album. It's just a solid live version on the studio album. And then the ending, man, it's so I think the piano they're using is like intentionally off key, and it's nice and scary and sets you up to enjoy the next couple songs really well.
yeah, it's a good opener to this record for sure. So the core of the recording is from the Dead's performance on Valentine's Day 1968 at the Carousel Ballroom, which I listened to that on the live version. It's interesting. They intro it with Jerry saying that they're playing this respectfully in memory of Neil Cassidy, who had died 10 days before. And then Bob goes, he's not dead, which is kind of an interesting hippie-ish thought of like, yeah, he might have shed his mortal coil, but he's still with us. And also, I mean, he is a very legendary figure. He is still in the eyes of, or in the minds of the culture in many ways. As long as people are reading On the Road, they'll be thinking of Neil Cassidy. So I thought that was kind of interesting. There are also segments from three other shows patched in. One from the Shrine Auditorium on either 11/10 or 11/11/67, and then also segments from their shows at the Kings Beach bowling alley between 2/22 and 24/68. In his book, Phil says that all four live performances of the other one are layered on top of each other at the beginning of the other one, because he said that they all start largely the same. And so they could just put all four. And that's why when it transitions from Cryptical into the other one, it's just like a sonic bonanza. Like there's so much sound happening.
Yeah.
And then they started to diverge. And when they did, they cut down the three and just left the one from Valentine's Day to kind of take off from there. So kind of interesting the way that they produce that. I think it's pretty cool. Um, on I think when you listen to it with headphones on, it's pretty clear that it cuts the live version. On
Oh yeah.
vinyl, it definitely still is clear, but not as clear. The sound is just a
Hmm.
bit less pristine, and so it's a little bit harder to divine when it's cutting in, but I just still think it's pretty obvious. One other thing, so I love the drumming segment, Mickey's intro, because this is the first album he was on with the Dead. At 126 on That's It for the Other One. A lot of cool little drum moments throughout this album, and that's the first of a few to come. And then, yeah, that heavy, spacey sound. To me, it somewhat resembles Pink Floyd's Saucer Full of Secrets, which was released just 20 days before this album was at the end of June 68. Obviously, these bands are operating on different sides of the pond and 9 time zones away from one another. I don't think that it was that they were one was cribbing the other or anything like that. I think that there was just this psychedelia in the air. Like I said, the Beatles were going to India to learn about meditation and stuff, and dropping acid and whatnot. Like we were full on. The Summer of Love was 67. We were full on. Well, depends on who you ask, but when you talk to the people like Bob, if you ask Bob Weir, when was the Summer of Love, he would say 1967. 1968 is when things got weird. So there was that in the air. But what's interesting to me is the Dead and Pink Floyd, both authentically psychedelic acts. There's nothing like contrived about what they're trying to do psychedelically with their albums. It's like some psychedelic records, it's like the band is trying to make something that's psychedelic, and then others like this one or Saucerful, it's the musical equivalent of squirting an entire dropper bottle of acid onto the blotter paper and then just watching it spill off all over the sides. Like they're not constrained to what's on the paper. It's going everywhere. They just are like, whatever. Let's get all the way weird. And the
Yeah.
Dead definitely accomplished that with this album. Um, so I think that spacey segment at the end is tremendously good and a really cool artifact of the psychedelic DNA that was in the culture and going through these guys at this moment in time. Second track, New Potato Caboose. So this one they only played 35 times live, all between 65 and 69. And I think this is a nice recording. What's your thought on New Potato?
I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed the song anyway, and I think that this is probably the one track of the five that like really stood out as benefiting from being in studio versus live. I thought they were able to do quite a bit with it, a couple acoustic guitars in there too to help it out, and I I really enjoyed listening to this, especially near the back half of the song when Pigpen really started wailing on the organ. I just I enjoyed New Potato stood out to me as not my favorite track on the record, but the one that I think sounded the most elevated because of its studio, because it's in the studio. What about you?
I liked it a lot too. I think that there's just some really nice noodly playing by Jerry. I dare say a bit of Indian beat stringing going on with the way he's performing the song. And then I think that one of the things that allows them to kind of elevate it in the studio is that the stacked vocals sound really clear and clean. You can really hear
Yes.
what they're doing vocally. Also a sign of things to come because that became a calling card of the Dead in their 1970 albums, which I think are their masterpieces. And we'll get there eventually with these album reviews. But it was kind of cool to see like, oh, well, that's where they're going. You know, the same year that Crosby, Stills, and Nash were founded and were doing the stacked vocal thing really, really well. It's, you know, coming across to the other side of San Francisco too, and the Dead are starting to play around with that. So yeah, I thought a really cool rendition. The next song, Born Cross-Eyed, they only played this one 12 times live, all between January and April of 1968. So if you get a live show and there's a Born Cross-Eyed on it, you know which 4 months it's from. um, this is one of Bob Weir's few true solo contributions to the Dead. He wrote all the music and lyrics. So it's interesting. In Dave Lemieux's liner notes to this vinyl, he talks about how he has a lot of papers from this time, a lot of notes, and what they were referring to the song as in the theater was either Weir's or Weir's song because it was
Hmm.
Weir's song.
Yeah.
I think the placement on the album is really nice. Following this driving, powerful New Potato, it's kind of cool to then get this song as like the one that's coming out of it. And like all of Bob's songs, it's very complicated and unique and interesting. But I think that this is a nice recording of Born Cross-Eyed. And I think we talked about one show where they did play Born Cross-Eyed, the
Was
one
the
that we talked about from
first,
January.
yeah, the first Born Cross-Eyed, right? That they ever
Yeah.
played live?
Yep.
Yeah.
And I think that this is a better version than that, I will say.
Yeah, I think so too. And it's only 2 minutes. I
I
think
know.
I'm a little surprised that they didn't play it more often because it honestly felt like they had prepped this in the studio to be like this single from this record to get some radio play. So I'm a little surprised that, and I'm not surprised that it didn't blow up off the charts. I'm not saying this is like a hidden gem in the record, but I'm just a little surprised. It felt, I mean, the track lengths, the other one was almost 8 minutes. New Potato is 8.5. Those aren't going to be played on the radio. You know, this is 2 minutes. This can be in and out on like a pop station in San Francisco, but
It could be, but
it's not going to be. But it's a little surprising that it wasn't dressed up a little more to be a little more radio friendly. But then again,
well,
I think none of this record was designed to be
Yeah.
friendly in any way other than psychedelic friendly.
Yeah, I agree. And also, Warner Brothers would not have been interested in that at all after how pissed off they were by all of this. They wouldn't
Yeah,
have been,
fair.
and they didn't have a producer to do that anyway. You know, it was
Right.
Dan and Jerry and Phil who were doing that. And so, and you're totally right. They didn't give a shit. So that's probably why it wasn't dressed up to be a record or a radio play, because they were like, whatever, this is our album. So that's the A side. The B side is just 2 songs long. The first is Alligator. They played it 84 times through 1971, and this begins the Pigpalooza that is side B of this album. It's interesting though, because if you would have told someone like, okay, there's a B side of the Grateful Dead's, you know, one of their 6 records that came out when Pigpen was alive, and it's all Pigpen songs, you'd probably think that there would be more Pigpen singing than there actually is on this B side.
Yeah, fair.
You know, there's a lot
That's
more
true.
jamming than there is Pigpen singing, I think.
Yeah. And he's kind of like the visual leader at the time. So it's a little surprising that both of his, songs are on the back half. But I gotta say, this Alligator Man, you
It's great.
called it Pig Palooza. I think there's also the Peak Palooza because this
Totally agree.
alligator is good. And I think what's best about it is the live segment that they splice in for like 3 whole minutes, it sounds like, is top tier.
Totally agree.
It's a great alligator.
I think this is the high point of the record too. It sounds like that's what you were saying.
Yeah.
I think that this is as good as it gets on this record. I also think that it kind of makes sense that, to your point, like Pig was the front man of the band for all intents and purposes at this time, but he was not into all the psychedelic stuff the way that the rest of the band was. And it seems like that was their vision of, we're going to make the psychedelic album. And so the fact that he wasn't as engaged with that stuff, it makes sense that even though he was the, you know, for all intents and purposes, the front man, it would have swerved away from him just a little bit because that wasn't his thing.
Right.
Um,
Okay. Yeah.
but I totally agree. I love this song. I love TC's playing on this song in the opening, like the front half. It's really, really great. The kazoos are really kind of funny and
I love it. I'm all in on the kazoo.
yeah,
Yeah.
very pranksterish. And I like it. And then Jerry is playing with a tone that's kind of kazooish somehow in the front half. And it just becomes like more distinctly fiery as the song opens up into that drums jam, and then into the live part where it's like, then he comes back with gusto in that big open jam that happens toward the end of the song. And then we get Pigpen's organ for the closing jam too, which also I think sounds really good. And then a second really feedbacky ending slash transition into Caution at the end of this. Another like true kind of feedback moment that I think is really good and leads really nicely into Caution, because then Caution kind of rises from that feedback in a really interesting way that does imitate a lot of what they were doing live at this time.
Not to put you on the spot, but do you know when that like live portion of Alligator is from? And if it's the same show as this, it's just like a transition. It's like it goes into on a studio album into the Caution.
Yeah, it is. I don't know, but I mean, on the album it says the dates of all the shows that they were pulling from on this and are on this album, and so I mean, I could venture a guess, but I'm just not sure. Probably one of these shows at the Carousel Ballroom in March of 68, 15th,
Hmm.
16th, 17th, 29th, 30th, and 31st. I would guess is one of those shows, or potentially parts of both. But yeah, it does sound like that. I did not come across that in my research. I probably should have pushed a little bit deeper, but that's okay. The Caution though is nice. They played this one 59 times and retired it after Europe 72. This is an interesting song. It dates back to their days as the Warlocks. Actually, they had a residency in Belmont, California, at this club called the Room, or sorry, the In Room. They were playing there 6 nights a week, and they noticed that trains would come by at a consistent time every night. And so rather than like stopping when that happened, I guess Phil and Bill were like, we could play with this. And so they started playing along with the train rumbling down the tracks, hence the name
Oh,
Caution, Do Not Stop on Tracks.
that's really neat.
Yeah. And so they created it, and now this is the finished version, at least the definitive album version. This song is just ear candy. Like there's so much going on, and it's so full of interesting sounds. There are all these, I mean, kind of like Born Cross-Eyed, there are these like stops and shifts and all this stuff that's going on. It just sounds great. And then this glorious feedback conclusion to the album that to me really feels pretty ascendant, and it lasts longer than I remembered. So I thought
Yeah, it
that
does.
I thought that this was a really powerful end to this record.
I completely agree. I love a caution in a show, especially in those Europe 72 shows. I think I gotta give you the 2 minute warning here,
Okay.
but that's it. That's the 5 tracks. That B-side, man, is good stuff.
I think that they're both good, but I agree the B side is better, I think, than the A side. It's so self-contained and powerful. Let me give you a couple Phil quotes before we end.
Oh,
In these
please.
these are both from his book Searching for the Sound. Great book, highly recommend it. So in regards to Caution, he says, quote, "At one point we were standing out there, entranced by the rhythm of the wheels clickety clacking all over the welds and the rails. Billy and I looked at each other and just knew. We simultaneously burst out, 'We can play this.' This later turned into Caution, Do Not Stop on Tracks, one of our simplest yet farthest reaching musical explorations." So it's kind of cool that he holds it in such high esteem. And then, speaking of holding things in high esteem, here's what Phil said about this album. "I've always felt that as an artistic statement, Anthem of the Sun was our most innovative and far reaching achievement on record. As a metaphor for the manifestations in our live performances, as a temporal collage, as a summation of our musical direction to date. The problem is, once you've delivered yourself of that radical rethinking, it's just not workable to keep repeating yourself in the same vein. For continued growth, it's necessary to take an almost dialectical approach to consider the polar opposite. Our live performances then would build upon the discoveries of Anthem and result in a double live album, Live Dead, while in the studio, the creative pendulum would swing from the organized chaos of this album to a far simpler, more focused approach: songs, songs, and more songs." So that is a sign of what's to come in the next really three, I would say, at least, studio offerings of the Dead that we will talk about. Not anytime soon. We got too much more to talk about in the coming months. But that's it for us. That's it for the other one today. Dave, any final notes before we bid these good people good night?
No, you'll hear us next talking about Dave's Picks Volume 46.
That's right. Can't wait. Until then, we bid you good night.
Love you the best, and I bid you good night. Good night. Good night. And I bid you good night. Good night. Good night. And I bid you good night. Good night. Good night. That's it. That's it. You got it.